Hello and welcome to a new interview from MinnMax. MinnMax is a Patreon about games, friends, and getting better. I am Ben Hansen. We are very honored today to be joined by Hironobu Sakaguchi, the father of Final Fantasy, to talk about his new game Fantasian, which is available on Apple Arcade. In this interview, we talk about Fantasian's development, Sakaguchi's life in Hawaii, a little bit about the development of Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, which he was the director for. Just a heads up for everybody, this interview is dubbed, but if you speak Japanese and you'd like to hear the raw, full Japanese version of this interview, you can follow the link in the description to check that out. If you enjoy this interview, we'd always appreciate it if you subscribe to MinnMax's YouTube channel, check out our other interviews, like one we did recently with Masato Kato, the writer of Chrono Trigger, writer and director of Chrono Cross, or you can head over to patreon.com/MinnMax with 2 N's, where you can unlock the podcast version of this interview, all of our other interviews, max spoilers, The Deepest Dive, which is our huge community game club, which we've done one for the Final Fantasy VII Remake that seems up your alley, or also Chrono Trigger we did last year as well. Anyways, without further ado, here's Sakaguchi. Welcome to MinnMax, sir. Congratulations on the success of Fantasian so far.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, what has surprised you about the reaction to the game so far?
I try to make it a habit to really look at the user's reaction, and this one being a very classic sort of RPG, a classic JRPG, I thought there might be some sort of negative reaction to that. Oh, we've seen this kind of game before, but surprisingly, it's very, very well received so far, the reactions that I've seen. And one person playing this game on their stream, actually, he started crying on stream because he said, this is exactly the type of game I wanted to play. Like, thank you so much for bringing this game out into the world. And watching that type of reaction really kind of got to me too. So it was very uplifting for me to see people react that way.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I think there's so much love for classic JRPGs and there's so much nostalgia, but you were worried that people would be craving something new from the RPG genre?
The inception of this project, if you will, is about 3 years ago. I had the opportunity to, on a different broadcast / stream kind of like this one, play Final Fantasy VI with my colleagues and developers at the time. And it really just seeing how that game unfolded, the tone, the style in which the gameplay takes place, it was really kind of reminded me of how much I love that genre. And if you kind of cast that in a good light, you could say it's me returning to my roots and wanting to make a game like that. But if you cast it in a not so good light, if you will, I think games have, of course, evolved a lot over the years, and there's a lot of new genres, a lot of new innovation that's happening right now. And in a way, with Fantasian, I kind of went opposite to that flow. And, it's something that I wanted to create, but I think there was always in the back of my head a little bit of concern, if you will, that going opposite to that flow, how would the users and the players react to it?
Oh, it's fantastic. We are very happy to have this type of game. So thank you for making it.
Thank you.
Why do you think that is in general that older creators, not old, but older, have a compulsion to return to the roots? What is it that makes you nostalgic yourself for the old days?
I think as creators, there's always this desire to innovate and to really take on new challenges and kind of evolve the game or the genre that you're working in. But at the same time, I think there is another aspect. And looking at myself, I've, of course, matured a lot since I first entered this industry. And I think that style has really become a very strong foundation. And for lack of a better word, I guess you could say what I've done and honed over the years has become ripe in a way. And the game industry as a whole, I feel, is still very, very young, of course. And there's this hunger and craving that everyone wants. Oh, let's innovate. Let's try something new. We got to experiment and explore and go outside these boxes. But at the same time, when you build a game on top of a very solid foundation that had the time to mature and to ripen in a way, I think, it's not necessarily the new aspect that you bring, but a very kind of matured experience that has a rock solid foundation. And I don't know if that's the age speaking as an older creator here, but I think that there is something to be said about kind of building something on top of a solid foundation.
Yeah. So with that solid foundation, what is the wisdom that you are constantly trying to impart on the younger staff? What are the lessons that you keep trying to drill in over and over again that they're probably very sick of hearing at this point?
Well, first, I think I should start by saying that a lot of the team members were sort of well-aged, like myself, with respect to Fantasian, and some of them actually were involved in certain Final Fantasies, and this has happened strictly by coincidence. So Mistwalker itself is a very young company as well. It's about 20 years old, and a lot of the programmers and artists that I work with now, we kind of met along the way in this 20-year journey. So a lot of the team members I've worked with for around at least 10 years, I want to say. So not all of them, if anything. Most of them are probably not the young kids you might imagine that they are working on this. So it wasn't so much me imparting this wisdom onto young kids, telling them to do this, that they might be tired of hearing after, me beating it into them. But in fact, it was more us knowing what we wanted and each other kind of subconsciously knowing what the game was supposed to become and having this certain level of trust in each other. So a lot of it came down to, well, how do we optimize the strengths and really leverage the pros and cons of each team member, each talent that they bring to the table to collectively create a much more elevated experience.
With that level of wisdom and trust amongst the team, it sounds like a pretty peaceful development. How would you characterize the development of Fantasian?
I would say it perhaps was a pretty peaceful development environment, if you will. And very early on the project, I had made it clear that this was kind of myself returning to my roots of development, my roots of kind of the Final Fantasies that of the pixel art era. And how to make a Final Fantasy game is actually quite it's methodical in the sense that you start off with the scenario for the game, and a lot of the game's mechanics and systems are almost baked into this storyline and the scenario. So the flow was clear of what needed to be done, and the scenario and the base or foundation of what the game was going to be built on top of was really easy to share and kind of build this common understanding among ourselves within the team. So, of course, there were some innovations that we took on within that. The diorama environments and backgrounds, of course, was a big challenge, as well as the Dimengeon system was another kind of innovation. But, despite those, I think everyone had a very solid understanding of what it was we set out to develop.
Yeah. With the Dimengeon idea specifically, who had that eureka moment of, aha, I know what to do. Let's just have you bank all these things up. It's so brilliant.
Like most things with this game development cycle, it all kind of begins with a little bit of my own selfishness, if you will. And this all happened when I was test playing an early build in the conference room one time, and the controls inside of Fantasian, of course you can play with the controller, but I imagine most people are playing on a touch panel interface. So when you place a pin, the character will of course traverse a few different scenes perhaps, and then ultimately arrive at wherever that pin was placed. And I actually wanted to kind of check up on how good the programming was. So it was a little bit of me kind of prodding and poking the programmer to see how good his code was. And I placed a pin really, really far away on a treasure chest to see if the character knew to, which paths to take and how to overcome certain obstacles in the map, to see how complete the programming was. And as the character was traversing these many different scenes, it made me realize, wow, it's actually very fun to explore these diorama worlds. And I was almost sad to interrupt this experience with these random encounters. And I think at the time that was all I had said. I just left that on the table in the conference room and made that one comment, to which the director of the game probably took it to heart and took it home and said, well, how do we solve this issue? And between him and I think the battle designer, they came up with a solution called the Dimengeon, which allows players to bank these random encounters for a later time.
So you're in Hawaii right now, right?
Yeah.
Nice. Can you talk about your history with Hawaii?
Wow, my history. I would say it's probably been about 25 years since I kind of planted my roots in Hawaii. But in spite of it being 25 years, there were about 3 week spans, I would say, where I would spend half the time in Hawaii and the other half in Japan. So I would be traveling a lot, going back and forth. And this year, of course, with the pandemic, I was unable to go to Japan. But with respect to Hawaii, actually, it's a very humid ecosystem and environment. But even though it's humid, it has nice wind. So it doesn't feel as humid as it might actually be. It actually feels a little bit dry. So I think it's honestly, for me, the perfect environment for which humans can exist. And well, what that means, of course, when it's perfect for humans, that means it's also perfect for bugs and insects and geckos. So you have a lot of that also encroaching on in your life.
I visited Square Enix maybe 5 years ago or so, and folks there talked about how there's just a different vibe amongst game development in Hawaii. They said specifically with Final Fantasy IX that you could kind of feel the Hawaiian tones and relaxation seeping into the game itself. And I wonder if you can feel that as well.
I'm not entirely sure what direct effect it has, but what I can say, having lived in Hawaii for as long as I have, is that people are just nicer to each other. I spent a lot of time between Tokyo and LA as well. And one example that comes to mind is when you're on the road, no one shares the road. If anything, they'll cut in front of you and then honk at you for no reason, seemingly. But Hawaii is the opposite, where people really share the road. They let people in when there's a lane change. And if anything, people are too nice to each other. I think it's actually causing some traffic because everyone's like slowing down and trying to let the other person in. And it's, you wouldn't even hear any honking in Hawaii. So maybe those vibes do, in a way, kind of seep into the game, but I really can't come up with any specific examples of how that actually affected a game.
It must make recruiting for Mistwalker much easier to be like, hey, just come down and hang out in Hawaii.
Actually, in truth, most of the game development or the team is in Tokyo. And Hawaii, if anything, will probably be kind of a, hey, good job, everyone, pat on the back. We finished the game. Let's take a company trip to Hawaii. That's how I would place Hawaii.
Perfect. I heard this story, and I'm hoping you can shed some light on whether or not it's true. I heard that Spirits Within, the film, was developed in a skyscraper in Hawaii, and that the servers used to create the film were on the top floor of the skyscraper. And then after the film was done, these servers were so big they couldn't get them out of there, and they're still sitting at the top of this Hawaiian skyscraper.
I think that might have kind of expanded and grown a bit on its own. That might be a myth. But at the time when we were developing and working on Spirits Within, we used a lot of silicon graphics machines, and they're kind of just like normal sized desktops. I don't think there's any reason why you can't take that out of a normal sized building. But the Onyx systems, there are certain systems that are really huge, like the size of refrigerators, but we didn't use any of those. So maybe some truths got crossed and wires got mixed, and that turned into a myth of its own. But I don't think that's the case.
It's a great legend. I really wish it was true. By and large, Spirits Within, do you feel like that was the movie you wanted to make? Did you have to make a lot of compromises along the way?
It's interesting because when we took on that project, we had never made a movie before. And if anything, it was almost a sort of research project. It was an R&D project or challenge to ourselves to push the boundaries in what was possible with CG animation. So I almost looked at it as this massive research project. And knowing what I know now, looking back, of course, there are many things I would have done differently or optimized, perhaps. But back then, it was an all-in experience for everyone. And I think there were moments in production where we thought, is this movie ever going to be finished? So I can say for certainty that just the fact that we completed this project for me was a massive achievement.
Yeah. With the success of something like Zack Snyder's Justice League these days, do you think you'd ever want to go back and recut the film, make a new version of it yourself?
I never really gave that idea much thought, but if everything can easily be digitized, we're not dealing with film anymore like we were back then. So if we could digitize everything, and even on my own workstation, I could work on it in 4K. So that's an interesting food for thought there. Maybe I'll quietly download it and work on it myself.
So cool. Get Uematsu to do the music. This could be great.
Yeah. そうだね. New music. Yeah, by Uematsu-san.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your history just on Apple. Your thoughts on the company along the way. I'm sure you've looked up to them for a while. What have you always admired about the company before you got to work with them so directly here?
Apple was actually one of the main reasons that I decided to enter the game industry. And one of my first computers was the Apple II, on which I played games like Wizardry and Ultima, and even used software like VisiCalc, which is kind of like the predecessor to all the spreadsheet-based software that we have nowadays. And there was a lot of different C languages that were also being developed and innovated at the time. So it was just a massive culture shock to me. Wow, how can something like this even exist? And that was the Apple II. At the time at Square Enix, PCs, of course, were the main preferred platform of choice for development. But as a Mac evangelist, I, of course, insisted everyone on my team would have one Mac each. And this was back in the day when there was no internet, or it wasn't nearly as developed as it was or as it is today. So there was actually a way to connect these different Apple computers together using the phone line. And it was a very primitive network, but almost as a hobby during development, I put together this phone line network environment for the dev team. And we built things over this kind of micro network of Apple computers. And it ultimately ended up kind of affecting Square Enix's very pipelines for how they developed games internally. And, I think Apple has a lot of these very unique systems. And although, of course, development will mainly be done on PCs, I think there's this sort of attraction for me that really Apple does. They create these things they're very unique. And, Fantasian might become my kind of retirement project, if you will. This might be the project after which I kind of go into retirement. So being able to work with Apple again on a project like this, it's kind of the reason I entered the game industry, and now it might be in a way my send-off. It's come full circle. So it's a very interesting, poignant moment for me as well.
Yeah. What kind of things would you develop on the Apple network within Square Enix compared to the PC?
Well, it wasn't necessarily anything we developed per se. It was more as a communication tool, and the chat features. We had different kind of chat mechanisms that we would use, leaving things on the server so people can kind of keep an ongoing repository or a living repository of data or communication or elements on this server, which really, I think, revolutionized the way people interacted with data. And it was interesting to see also the idea of communication. Of course, there are things I think you could only say over internet chat or network chat. I know this is kind of unthinkable given our current environment and the omnipresence of the internet, but there are things that would be hard to say in person, things you really couldn't say in meetings, but in that chat box, you kind of feel comfortable enough to say things. So it greatly improved that element of people being able to interact and put their ideas on the table, I think, with this micro Apple network.
And which era of Square was this? What games were you working on specifically where this kind of rose up?
Final Fantasy no.
I want to say it was around Final Fantasy 3 or 4. So right around 1990, I would say.
Here's a broad question. Can you think of like the greatest fuck yes moment in your career? Like the most exciting time when you're like, yes, we pulled something off. What was the greatest success that you remember specifically?
It's a really interesting proposition, and I think the closest you would come to it is when we finish a game or when a game is released, perhaps. But I personally generally have more regrets, a lot of shoulda, coulda, woulda moments when I see a game. Oh man, if we had just had a little more time to tweak this or adjusted that. So no game, of course, we release is perfect. And there is a great sense of achievement when it's finally delivered to market and people are able to play it. But it's very far from, I would say, a yes moment. And even with Fantasian, if you will, it's it's been very well received. In spite of that, I think there's some moments where it never really gets to that FES moment, and I'm very thankful that it's well received, but not quite the FES. So it's a very challenging proposition or question, I would say.
Yeah. Even when you went back recently to play Final Fantasy VI, you didn't look at that and you still were seeing flaws in it all these years later? During
that live streaming broadcast program, actually, I was more afraid that we were going to find some bugs during the stream. So if I would try not to do anything too weird that might cause a glitch, or if I see some odd behavior, I think to myself, was that a glitch? It was very nervous, a very nervous experience for me. And there were in fact moments where I would be playing it and notice, there should have been a sound effect there, or that wasn't quite what I thought it was going to be. So that's kind of how it was, my experience playing Final Fantasy VI after all these years.
It's impossible to shatter people's love and nostalgia for Final Fantasy VI. If they found a bug, it would just make it more charming.
As long as you're not running into any non-progs or non-progression issues, I think it could be seen as charming. But when you're the one who made it and you knew you were in a position to do something about it, it's always it makes you wince sometimes, I think.
So you say you might be retiring after this game. I find that hard to believe, from a creator who's worked on Final Fantasy and The Last Story. It seems like you're constantly teasing this might be the end. So what makes it different this time?
As they say never. But I think there is a very plausible chance that this could be the last. And who knows, after we finish this and deliver it and I take a few steps away from it for a few months, I might have that creative urge to build something again. But in a lot of ways, Fantasian for me was returning to my roots and really kind of reflecting on what I've done after all these years and what I feel we've achieved in Fantasian. There really was nothing left on the table for me. I put everything, all my experience, all the types of games that I like into this game. So if you told me that this was going to be my last game, I think there wouldn't be any regrets there.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. What would retirement look like for you? Would you sit back and replay all of your greatest games?
It's a huge undertaking and a huge accomplishment. Every game, every product you kind of assemble and put out there. And each time it feels like you're ringing this for a little extra something. And it almost feels like you at some point reach a moment where you ring it, but there's nothing left to be wrung out from that. And that is the feeling that I have right now. So it's not so much I'm going to retire and do this or do that. I haven't given much thought actually to what retirement might look like for me. It's more the idea that there's not much left to be wrung out of this creative source.
But then, hey, you got part 2 coming up, right? So you got to find something.
Yeah.
Definitely. We are full steam ahead developing part 2 right now. So doing everything we can in our power to make sure it's a very enjoyable experience for everyone.
Well, hey, thank you so much. I'm really enjoying my time with the game. So
thank you.
Thank you so much to the entire team for creating it. And thank you for all the great games you made throughout your career. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for watching and listening to this interview. You can always subscribe to MinnMax's YouTube channel or support us over at patreon.com/MinnMax with 2 N's to unlock the podcast version of this interview and future ones. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye. If you are sick of snark, clickbait, and an avalanche of movie news, you can help support independent games media by subscribing to MinnMax's YouTube channel here or checking out the benefits over on Patreon. It's a nice, clean handshake. You support us, and we won't make dumb, condescending stuff for you. Your support helps us continue our mission of focusing on games, friends, and getting better. Patreon.com/MinnMax with 2 N's. We'd appreciate it.